All right. I am happy to welcome a friend to Rice, Antoine Picon, who is probably had the biggest draw at the Brocken Talk Pavilion talks of almost anyone I've seen so far in those series with the students, which gives me great hope as a historian and theorist that's what has pulled our students out to, unless it was the free coffee and the cold day, but we had a very good discussion in the Brockstein where you were very generous with the students. Antoine is currently the G. Ware Travelsteed Professor of the History of Architecture and Technology at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he co-directs the doctoral programs and teaches history theory courses focusing on architecture, urbanism, and technology from the Enlightenment to the very, very present. Antoine received engineering degrees from the École Polytechnique and from the École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées, an architecture degree from the École d'Architecture de Paris-Villemain, and a doctorate in history from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. Note to self, we clearly need to add more syllables to our own school name. His most recent publication is Digital Culture and Architecture, which surveys this contemporary landscape of digital practice, putting the digital into a broader historical context, while also acknowledging the paradigm shift that digital technologies have wrought upon the discipline as well as on practice. So consider, for example, that today students will design, and practitioners too, will design in Rhino in 3D and then cut sections and plans, two-dimensional sections and plans. It's a completely different way of working from having built up the 3D from, for example, drawing the two-dimensional. So there's a complete paradigm shift, or think of BIM and the way that that's starting to integrate different aspects through technologies. In today's talk, Antoine will turn to a subset of this big topic of the digital paradigm shift in order to address the specific contemporary transformation of and politics underlying what we call ornament. Now, at first blush, ornament seems to be a literally superfluous topic. Isn't it just the stuff that's added onto buildings at the end of the design process? Isn't it just there for variation, decor, and identity? Like the carved capitals at Lovett Hall, which depict academia with their symbolic forms ranging from the bookworm to the football player, which I find a little bit disconcerting that even in 1912 that was seen to be the social spectrum of the undergraduate student. So it's, isn't it just that kind of stuff? Digital technology, media, and fabrication techniques have complicated this understanding of ornament as an add-on. Ben Van Berkel's Galleria department store that we saw a couple weeks ago had a facade of glass discs that are integral to the facade, not added on, but are there for their pearlescent shimmer during the day and LED lighting at night. Or think of Andrew Atwood's column yesterday, is that fuzziness ornamental? So in our contemporary world of fuzzy shapes, mediated surfaces, and customized fabrication, how do we define what ornament is or why it's there? In putting politics and subjectivity on the table, Antoine puts the spotlight on that latter question. Ornament is no longer just an applied sign, but it still engages the subject, and particularly architecture's collective subject. So the questions in front of us are, how does the architecture engage? What role ornament plays in defining that engagement? And to what extent politics today, a field that has been similarly transformed by digital media and technologies, to what extent that politics depends on a contemporary ornament in ways that differ from an earlier generation's political dependence on architectural symbolism. So here to pose those questions and push them further, we welcome Antoine Picon to Harvard and to Rice. Please note that his visit continues tomorrow with a lunchtime conversation which starts with a response from Christopher Haidt.
Okay, two couple of preliminary remarks. First of all, I'd like to thank Sarah for this warm welcome. And actually, I think I should immediately jump to the conclusion because you pretty much summarized admirably what I intend to say tonight. Last thing I wanted to say is that, of course, I had a good turnover at cafe. That's what French are good for. So, okay. So ornament. Ornament is a much discussed question today because of its so-called return that has drawn a lot of attention from both theorists and practitioners. And here, the cover of Farshid Moussavis and Michael Kubo's book on this issue. This return is often linked to the rise of digital culture, but in ways that are not always clear. And above all, and contrary to what the term seems to presuppose, the relation between the way we understand ornament today and the way it was defined in the past is not absolutely evident. So what I'd like to do tonight is probably not to present a totally complete piece of work, but rather a series of definitive conclusions, but more a program on an investigation of this question of the return of ornament and how should we understand it. I'm also going, and that's going to be very difficult for me, trying not to read the text, which is a big tendency I have, but try to address from my notes a bit more freely. What I intend to do is basically, and this was very admirably said by Sarah, follow two lines of inquiry. The first has to do with the relation between ornament and the question of the subject. Who's looking at architecture, but as we will see, there are other ways to define the subject of architecture. So that will be the first line. The second line will have to do with the question of politics, and of course with the hypothesis that subjectivity, politics are intimately linked in this question of ornament. In concrete terms, what I will do is actually to try to follow the following steps. First, a discussion about in what sense is contemporary ornament very different from what we used to call ornament, even if ornament is one of the less well-defined notions. I'll come back to why in a moment, but there were a certain number of features of ornament in the past that we no longer find today in our contemporary discourse on ornament. So that will be the first part. And then, I'm sorry for those who are expecting a purely digital stuff, but we'll delve into the past in two directions. The first one will have to do with this idea, this kind of connection between ornament and subjectivity, try to give a few examples in the past to try to clarify the question. Then a bit shorter, the relation of ornament, ornamentation and politics. And then finally a return to the present to try with these two promenades in the past, try to propose an interpretation of what is going on and try to answer this question: in what sense could we conceive today of a politics of ornament? So, let me begin by the somewhat disconcerting character of this notion of a return of ornament. Why is it disconcerting? For something to be disconcerting, it must be both somewhat foreign and at the same time with familiar features. On the side of familiar feature, in contemporary ornament, we see the return of a series of long repressed preoccupation and possibilities. For example, the concern definitely with a type of sensory satisfaction based on patterns and colors, even on the use of images that modern architecture had relatively checked. These things were not absent totally from modern architecture, but pretty limited. So we see a number of things that are familiar. But they are, however, quite different from what we used to call ornament. I'll return to that in a moment. Just to illustrate, this is, of course, a picture of a project by Greg Lynn, typical of the interest taken on all this question of colors, etc. In a less blobby, more strict way, the Sauerbrück and Hutton Pharmaceutical Laboratory in Biberach. In another genre, this very well-known project using figurative images, but in a way a bit different from what they used, from the way one used to manipulate images, of course the Herzog and de Meuron library. In what sense can we say that contemporary ornament, what is called ornament today, is quite different from traditional ornament? Let me begin by a remark, which is that ornament usually did not cover the entire skin of the building. There were exceptions. Let's think, for example, of Baroque, South American or South Italian Baroque. But most of the time, even if we take Baroque, ornamentation was contained and limited to certain moments of the facade, certain parts of the facade. Here, a typical Roman Baroque church, Santa Susanna by Maderno, as we can see, there are much more bare surfaces than ornament. Ornament is relatively scarce. Most of the time, ornaments were arranged as discrete elements, and this is a principle still understood by 19th century Beaux-Arts architecture. Here is a project by Ferliger, who will later design a series of amazing bridges and stations in Paris, and there is a very dramatic treatment of some parts of the facade, as here this detail, but this is just a very local moment. So of course, there is a strong contrast already between that kind of condition and the pervasive surface condition of ornament in many cases today. So very often the ornamental dimension can be linked to a pattern repeated on the entire facade, like here on this Zaha Hadid project for Dubai. Sometimes it can be the very movement of the facade that acquires a kind of ornamental character, like here at the Maison Folie by Lars Brybroek. This pervasive condition seems definitely closer, for example, to the Islamic conception of ornament. And the Hadid projects, worth noting, is clearly intended in reference to Islamic ornamental tradition. So another way to put it, and this is what Sarah mentioned, is that if we limit ourselves to the Western tradition, you had the strong idea that ornament was something added, either to a skin or a skeleton. So this, today ornament is no longer added. Hence also a very surprising aspect, which is that structure sometimes today seem to acquire a kind of ornamental quality. For example, the Herzog and de Meuron Stadium may appear as a kind of giant ornament. The same is true in some ways of the nearby water cube and the Voronoi. When you deal with Voronoi today, is it something structural? Is it something ornamental? It's not entirely clear. So the fact that ornament is added is not a trivial detail. It's not a trivial detail because since the Romans, at least, ornament was by definition what was added to the building. In Roman law, you had actually a definition of ornament that expanded beyond architecture. Ornament was what was non-structural, but what was fixed to the wall, etc., that you couldn't move easily. So it was different it was in between structure and furniture, if you like. But you could remove it while preserving, in theory, the integrity of the construction. So this added character was at the foundation of what I would like to call the paradox of ornament. Namely, that the fact that ornament was actually all the more essential that it was added. Just like architecture was, in some sense, an addition to the art of building. In the Vitruvian tradition, ornament was both essential and added. It revealed the true order of things like a cosmetic. So I promised to the students I would speak about makeup. So a few considerations about cosmetics. Because it may enable us to understand better how something can be added and at the same time essential. And we may refer actually to the etymology of the word cosmetic. And as some of you may know, cosmetic has a relation to cosmos. And cosmetic, they both derive from a Greek verb, kosmein, meaning to arrange and to adorn. And in ancient Greek, kosmos meant both the ornament of a woman's dress and a kind of general order. It had also a kinship to women's hairdressing, and how not to remember in passing, at least if we can pass, that the Ionic capital was precisely supposed to imitate Ionic women hairdressing. So the ornament was an arrangement that adorned as well as revealed the underlying order, that very order that architecture was supposed to embody. Another way to understand it, remaining in the realm of cosmetics, is to ask oneself what makes the power of good makeup. I don't have, but I can fantasize. It's added, but at the same time it must reveal something essential about the person. So it's about revealing, in a way, the true visage. So one could think of ornament then is as what happens when a building acquires a visage. In other words, what happens when a building becomes something we call architecture. So ornament was an essential part of this becoming, and it was essential precisely because it was added. So that's a bit complicated, but that's how it was. And this understanding of ornament is still very present in the 19th century, when Schinkel, for example, at the Bau Academy, put these ornaments, the terracotta ornament, these series of frieze that run around the building. They're both clearly added to the structure. They don't belong to the primary tectonic order, but they comment upon it and they underline the profoundly rhythmic nature of the building. You will find, by the way, and I'm always struck by the fact that this connection is not always made, but when you take Sullivan, and in Sullivan Wainwright's building, the ornament plays also this role of a kind of essential addition to that underlines the order. And by the way, speaking of, it's interesting for me to remind you that the Wainwright, one pillar out of two, has no steel in it. So we're really in a, and it actually adds up to the impression of density and structural reality. So in some ways, the makeup is the covering of reality that make it more truthful. So today, of course, ornament is often sprawling. It's not really added. So it's hard to see where is the continuity. Ornament used to be local, is general. Ornament used to be clearly added. It's not so added. Most of the time, it's a kind of integral part of the fabric of the facade. Last point, made repeatedly by practitioners, Farshid Mousavi, Jesse Reisers, and others, is the idea that ornament should have no meaning today, and Farshid is very adamant on that, and they're with an obsession to avoid what they perceive as the shortcomings of postmodernism and its abuse of sometimes superficial and cheap symbolism. And so that to remain neutral, I took a French example. This is a building in Paris by Manolo Nunez. It does exist. And it's true that that's perhaps a bit too symbolic, although you don't know what exactly is the symbol. But nevertheless, one may understand that one wants to avoid that. But this is, of course, a profound departure at the same time from an ornamental tradition in which ornament was inseparable from a series of symbols that were indeed intended to convey meaning. So remaining in a somewhat comparable vein, you could have a bit extreme ornamental project, like this is a project for the ornamentation of the 19th century part of the Louvre by Carpeaux, and you might not realize it, but this is the French Empire carrying the torch of enlightenment and protecting agriculture on your right and science on your left. So that was perhaps a bit extreme, but let's not forget that in most cases, ornament was more discreetly, like here, related to a set of meanings, natural or to the arts, etc. So there was a very rich sphere of meaning extending from the discrete to the probably not so discrete, but which related ornament to the question of meaning. And I'll come back toward the end of this lecture. I think we have to reconnect to this question of meaning in a way or another. So, once again, beyond the return of a concern with pattern, texture, color, sensory perception, etc., beyond the use of iconography in certain cases, where is the return? So, as I said, I'm going to propose two possible threads. So now, sorry for those who really like the present, we're going to delve into the past. Two possible threads making past and present, so I'll come back to the present at the end, linking former conception of ornament and what is supposed to return today. So the first will be this relation to subjectivity. But of course, when we say subjectivity, there are various ways to define the subject of architecture. The first would be who is producing the ornament. The subject of the ornament can be the person who actually makes the ornament. And we'll discuss also what making means in that case. And the second, of course, dimension is for whom is the ornament meant. So by whom and for whom. There have been various answers, so I don't want here to enter into a kind of encyclopedic discussion of all the variation. I'd like just to outline a few major ways in which this question has been answered in the past, beginning by who. The first subject involved with the question of ornament was very often the designer, the architect himself. Ornament was supposed to reveal something essential about the personality of the designer, and even moldings. It's very striking how a 17th or 18th century critic of architecture usually will speak about the molding of this architect, etc., as more expressive in some ways of his inner personality, his inner genius, than many other things that appear to us more evident today. This is the spirit, so to say, capturing the spirit of Scamozzi profiles, according to 18th century theorist Blondel. So ornament was from the start associated to the creative power of the architect. But of course the question repeatedly arose in such a context of the relation between such a power and the rules that were supposed to govern architecture. Architecture being the very art that dealt with order. And there was a raging battle for centuries between, rules and personal expression, and ornament was on one of the fields in which this expressed itself. For example, it's quite interesting to see that Mannerism raised this question of license, and even if you look at the details become even more problematic when you look at Giulio Romano at the Te Palace in some ways than the general, already not so classic ordinance of the facade. By the way, there were also, we have forgotten about it, but Michelangelo gave birth to discussion of the same type about the nature of his ornament, etc. In France, interestingly, one of the great admirers of Michelangelo, who happens to be the first formally trained architect in France, claimed that an invention of ornament was among the key qualities of the architect. And this is a guy called Philibert Delorme, and Philibert Delorme invented a new genre of column that he used at the Palace of the Tuileries. You have the new ringed column of Philibert on the left, then what's left of one of the arcades of the Tuileries, and Philibert would inspire, until the 18th century, all kinds of attempts. This is the columns of Ledoux at the Arquet-Senans salt factory. Interestingly also, speaking of the subject of the architect, Philibert is the first architect ever in France to write a treatise and to put as the first picture of his treatise his portrait. And in case you've not understood what this is about and all the connection between architecture and the designer as a subject, at the end of the treatise you have the bad architect on the left who is blind, and going where the wind pushes him in a kind of Gothic, dull landscape. And on the right, the virtuous architect who teaches, and among the things he teaches, you may note the cornucopia on the bottom left, which clearly is related to this question of the mediation between nature and artifact. And you can see that the cornucopia is repeated on the frontispiece of the temple. So there again, good architect, bad architect, it has to do also with the question of the creative individual. You find, of course, the same question looming in Piranesi. This relation between ornamental profusion, for example, in the treatise on the chimneys, and is, of course, a testimony to the qualities possessed by the designer. And this kind of relation is made quite explicit, for example, in one of these portraits of Piranesi. This link was to remain true for a very long time. Among the remarks made by Frank Lloyd Wright about his former master Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright famously said that there was something energetic, profoundly virile in the way Sullivan drew ornament. So something we do not necessarily always understand today, but ornament was in direct link with this question of the subject. So, first subject, the designer. But there is another subject who is maybe involved in the making of ornament, at least if we don't prefabricate, and that's the sculptor, the worker, the guy who actually carves or, makes the thing. And for a very long time, you know, this personality is somewhat in the background, looming in the background, but it's a preoccupation for the architect, how he relates to the other guy who makes also ornament. And for example, in the first French treatise on architecture, a dictionary of architecture, you have this very interesting plate in which you have the various genres of moldings. On the left, it's with the names used by workers, and on the right with the proper names of architectural field. For example, you have a gros tor, which means tor is geometric, tor, I think, torus in English, and it becomes a big sausage in the terms of the workers. So, gros boudin. Which means one thing is that actually ornament is a complex place of negotiation between the individual on the left, who is actually making the ornament, and the individual on the right, who is designing the ornament, talking officially about the ornament, etc. This will become a major question in the 19th century through people like Ruskin. For Ruskin, let me remind you that ornament, the true quality of ornament is not good abstract, pure design, but it's the creativity of the hand that is producing it. And for Ruskin's followers, this question of producing ornament, enabling a creative capacity to express itself through the real making of ornament, is a central question. And this is, for example, here sculptors working for the Ruskin-inspired Oxford Museum of Dean and Woodward. And for Ruskin and his followers, contrary to Viollet-le-Duc, Gothic ornament was a testimony to the creative freedom of sculptors. What made Gothic truly organic for Ruskin was the capacity to reconcile this individual freedom with a collective spiritual inspiration. And this is where, by the way, that happens, this idea, this kind of big inversion, until Ruskin, everybody had been obsessed by the idea that ornament had to be as precisely produced as possible by the workers, and Ruskin then insists on the imprecision, on the imperfection even. Something that will inspire, leave long traces in modern architecture, and as you all know, Le Corbusier, who had a kind of Ruskinian youth at La Chaux-de-Fonds, rediscovered this idea of imperfection, but of course with the formwork, the wood formwork, like at the Unité d'Habitation, which become a kind of new ornamental condition in the second part of his life. So the designer and or the artisan producing concretely the ornament, we already begin to see that ornament is actually saturated by possible subjects. And with, of course, a question, should we distinguish between the two? What are the relation between these two subjects, etc. This becomes even more complex when you begin, and this is also the 19th century, to see a kind of almost pre-psychoanalytical attitude in ornament, with the idea that there is an impulse behind ornament, which is something you see typically with Zemper already, in which ornament derives ultimately not from the rules of art, but a kind of creative impulse. That is something deeply anthropological, which explains why Zemper makes relation, and we're back to something we've already seen, which is hairdressing and the kind of capital of Egyptian architecture. But behind that, you had the idea that there is a kind of impulse. Just like, when you're supposed to scribble in the margin because you're really bored by a lecture, what you're designing means something. So there is this idea of a kind of creative impulse, ornamental impulse, that looms throughout the 19th century. Then with a question that begins also to appear, what if, after all, ornament in the industrial era raised a similar question of a kind of impulse at work in the depth of a civilization? And these will give birth to all the questions pertaining on how to ornament industrial object, which is one of the big questions of the second half of the 19th century. Which is related, and this is also something we've forgotten, this impulse in ornamentation is strangely related to the question of prefabrication in the 19th century. This is a house in Montauban in the southwest of France, and pretty much all the ornaments are prefabricated. French version of terracotta ornament. So, a kind of subject. It's interesting to finish on that matter to note that the rejection of ornament, and this is a text some of you had to read, the rejection of ornament by the modern movement was linked to this idea of impulse. And you know what Lawes does when he explains that exterior ornaments are criminal, he actually based himself very literally on analysis by Lombroso, the criminologist, Italian criminologist Lombroso, who had studied how the criminal and the primitive mind, and sometimes the female mind, pretty much the same as primitive and criminal, as we know, for a 19th century criminologist, were keen on ornament. And Lombroso, for example, studied what he called the criminal potteries, you know, drawings made by prisoners imprisoned for serious offenses, and that liked to do these little drawings. So after all, adorning the facade could be part of this childish, potentially criminal condition. So this question of the ornamental impulse is a really fundamental question throughout the 19th century. So let me now, I won't delve too much into that, but after the by whom, let me now briefly evoke another type of subject, which is the for whom. For whom is the ornament intended? And there again, we have all kinds of possible understanding of the for whom. It can range from the simple passerby, who just sees a facade on his way to something else, to the client, for whom really the way ornaments are designed does matter, if only because he has to pay for them. So among the tasks of ornament, we find very early on the idea that it has to announce the quality and function of the building, and behind the building, beyond the building, its owner. This is something we've lost today, but ornament was pretty much codified in terms of social ranks. And in the French classical vocabulary of architecture, there was even a word, convenance, and convenance meant the exact relation between architectural ornament and the rank of the owner of the building. So for example, when the Prime Minister of Louis XIV does this castle, it's not only because it's a big building that it's shocking, because actually there were even bigger buildings owned by people who were not the kings in second half of the 17th century France. It's because actually the kind of ornamentation is royal in essence. And there are a strange set of similarities between Vaux-le-Vicomte and what immediately after Louis XIV will begin at Versailles. This is about the rank of the person who has this thing built. Toward the end of the 17th century, the idea becomes more complex because then you begin to have a kind of complex dialectic between exterior and interior, with the idea that the exterior is the kind of social position of the person, but the interior may reflect a different kind, more private kind of subjectivity. And, for example, a French writer, Charles Perrault, writes that there could be two types of ornament. The first one very serious for the exterior, and other more playful for interiors. And this will be the beginning of, for example, the Rococo interior with a very gendered kind of decoration. This is the great salon of the Hotel of Soubise, and with all the little cupids, etc. It's a Rococo interior that has definitely a gendered connotation. The owner is supposed to be a woman. So you begin to see this kind of thing. So ornaments from the exterior, ornaments from the interior, this is going to be a very long-lasting dichotomy throughout the 19th century, with the development of notions like the bourgeois interior, etc., but also with all kinds of paroxysmal variation. Let me just take two. That was sorry about that, although it's nice. Little marquise. But once again, you have to understand all the link it has to the kind of decoration. Okay, but let's move to more British eccentricity. This is Soane's house. And Soane's house, if you think a little bit about the contrast between the facade and the sprawling ornamental ornaments of the interior, very much ornament in the Roman sense, they are fixed, but could be removed, we begin to see in a new light this question there again of subjectivity. And in an even craziest, although the picture is bad, it's Pierre Loti, who was a guy who wrote exotic stories and was also an interesting travestite, early travestite in French culture, and he had the strangest house possible. So, just to conclude on this matter, ornament was deeply a question of relation to subjectivity, to the subject. With another layer of ambiguity, which is, we've talked of all these subjects, etc., but the question, for example, of the relation between the subject who designed and the subject for whom is designed is a totally ambiguous one. And a colleague of mine is finishing a book on the idea that the architect always tries to be the model for the client. So, and you could find traces of that. There is a kind of normative power of the architect. By the end, you don't know if the Vitruvian man, by the end, is the designer. It's a universal model of man supposed to rule architecture. You don't know who is exactly the person. But one thing is sure, it has to do with this question of ornament. And just a final picture from Lequeux, late 18th century French architect, totally obsessed by that. So that was the first part of my historical going back into history, and now I'll be shorter, it's a promise, on the second look back, that time on politics. So how can ornament be political? Well, we may already have a certain number of ideas. For example, when Louis XIV is not happy with the ornaments used on the castle of his first minister, the poor guy will end in jail, by the way, throughout for the rest of his life. We may begin to understand a few things. To understand better, perhaps I would propose another starting point, which is actually Venetian gondola. You may wonder what they're doing, but you may remember that Venetian gondola, there is a famous story of the Venetian government prohibiting excessive ornaments on gondola and imposing the uniform black color in order to avoid unnecessary luxury expenses that would have threatened the economy of the Republic. So let's assume for a minute that the story is true. What does it tell us about ornament beyond gondolas? The first one is that ornament is about ostentation. It's about showing off, which would mean, in modern and positive term today, communication. And communication, the more ornament, the more it has to do with power. And the Catholic Church was certainly one of the institutions that understood the better this power of ornament, this ostentation power of ornament, St. Peter's baldachin being perhaps one of the most spectacular ornaments ever conceived. So ornament, another thing, I spoke of the wealth of the Republic, ornament is expensive. It's actually capital that is immobilized. And by the way, one often presents the baldachin as an heresy from, because they melted the bronze door of the Pantheon. But actually it was pretty faithful to the Roman tradition of reusing ornament, because ornament was something that had to do with capital, that you had immobilized, but that you could transform. So I would say that communication, power, wealth, are pretty fundamental ingredients of politics. They are linked, and I won't enter too much into the details, but they are linked to the question, of course, of who communicates, who exerts power, who possesses wealth. Another element missing from my story, and I'll give an example in a minute, is that ornament has also a link with this notion of decor, which has to do in its turn with the idea of an immersive order. And the world in its entirety can be interpreted as a giant decor for man. So politics of ornament have generally played on these components. So for Alberti, for example, ornament, there is no strict definition of what ornament is in Alberti, and it's often misunderstood a little bit what he meant, but Alberti tried very hard to resurrect the old legal vision of ornament by the Romans. Namely, something that had a legal definition as heirloom, immobilized on the walls of houses, but also public spaces. Public space was ornamented in ancient Rome, and that was part of what made it public. was in a way a display of public wealth and power. And the politics of the empire, bringing back all kinds of ornament, marble, columns, statues to Rome, was a politics of ornament. And for Alberti, trying to recapture this Roman spirit of ornament that you can still find traces, by the way, in Piranesi in the late 18th century, was of course linked to the idea to try to recapture something of the virtue of ancient Rome. You have other conceptions of ornament. For example, for Barbaro, one of the great Italian commentators of Vitruvius, and that goes back to the idea of immersive order I mentioned before, ornament was clearly seen as part of a more all-encompassing decor. Am I understandable with my pronunciation of decor?
Yes.
Okay, decor. And architectural decor was what installed man in a world commensurate with its finitude. In a way, the task of architecture was to protect man from the infinity of nature and or the gods, and to install him into a measured world. And in just possible illustration of that would be the famous Olympic Theatre in Vicenza, this idea that the order of ornament is an order of a measurable world for man in between the abyss of nature and the gods. Later, there will be many other politics of ornament, generally linked to communication, politics of affirmation of the hierarchy of society, politics of affirmation of national issues, like I couldn't resist. This is the attempt by the French to create a French order. But you may note, in all modesty, on the right, it's the supposed order of the Temple of Jerusalem, and on the left, you might not see the charm of it. It's an attempt by Claude Perrault to design a French order using ostrich feathers. Plume d'autruche. So you might wonder why ostrich feathers, and this is where the politics can become complex. It started actually from a complicated problem, is that at the Louvre, they had begun by the wrong order. So they had not begun by the Doric, so they had a problem of superposition of order. They had so that they had they had to find something past the composite at the top of the palace. So you can see, you might think you're not in politics, but it's actually about the palace of the kings of France. So this is why they held this composition, and why ostrich feathers, to make it lighter than the composite. So, and with the idea that in some ways the French mind was so refined that it was even lighter than all the invention of the ancient, which, if you know Claude Perrault, is definitely what he had in mind with these very weird designs. So, politics of ornament can be sometimes disconcerting. Just like I'd like really to have a photo of this hall with the rugby player on the Capitals. That's something a little bit on that. And of course, there are multiple examples, more or less laughable, most of the time non-laughable, and sometimes we don't even notice them anymore, either because we pass by or because the building has been destroyed. Just to give you an example, I'm always struck by the reference of McKean, Mean and White at Penn Station to the ornaments of the Roman Empire. And of course, this is an empire for democracy, this is a railway station, and no longer, this is based actually on the orders of the Caracalla bathhouse in Rome, but the transposition from, an imperial empire to a democratic empire, all these things are by no means fortuitous. They are part of a politics of ornament. So, subjectivity, politics. So let me finally return to the present. And to what I call, rather than the return of ornament, the return of the question of ornament or the question of ornamentation. And I hope now to be a bit better equipped to try to understand what's happening today. What I'd like to argue is that what is returning is not so much ornament as we knew it. It's not a Vitruvian ornament. It's not even a Beaux-Arts ornament. It's probably a return of some of the questions raised by ornamentation. And among those questions raised linked to the question of subjectivity and politics and their possible links. So in order to move in that direction, let me note that there are a number of interesting features in today's ornament. it appears with a series of striking properties. As I've said, it's superficial, far more than traditional ornament, really a matter of skin. And at the same time, it seems to possess a tactile quality, as if the ornament was constantly trying to go beyond vision, to incite you to touch. By the way, I find it always striking how it looks to a braille. How do you call the alphabet for the blind? Braille? Braille. To a braille alphabet text, actually. It's really something that has a kind of haptic character. These kind of braille-like protuberances in the De Young Museum. This character often goes also with an almost hypnotic ambition. Contemporary ornaments seem in that respect to reinvent aspects sometimes of op art with repetition of form that becomes obsessional and blur, which seem to possess a movement of their own. It's not the best picture for that, but even here there seems to be something a bit hypnotic in this affair. The hypothesis I'd like to make at that stage is that what is often at stake is a kind of abolition of the distance, or rather the separation between subject and object. Because ornament does not depend anymore on a fixed point of view, like traditional ornamental arrangements. It is as if the subject and the architectural objects were in continuity one with another. It's quite striking now. I'm among the few people who actually really reads what designers write. Sometimes can be somewhat tedious, but must be the historian in me, I do think that this is important to read what they write. And it's striking to note how a number of actually digital designers precisely say that. That it's about using variously understood Deleuzian notion, like the notion of affect, which is claimed as a reference by designers as different as Farshid Moussavi or Ali Rahim. Beyond this type of philosophical reference, these affairs seem to be related to a vision of the world in terms of field and flow, a world in which there is nothing like classical substance, but rather events that happen in space and time, a little like what quantum mechanics describe. This is the probability of presence of an atom, of the electron around the atomic liturgy. So to return to philosophy, it's very close to the kind of Whiteheadian philosophy of nature populated with events rather than with things. So what this might ultimately have to do with is a new conception of subjectivity, a conception that explains also the repeated references made to Deleuze, but also more recently to Latour, and increasingly, at least in Europe, to certain aspects of Peter Sloterdijk's writings. With the idea, it all revolves around a certain number of things. The idea, for example, that the subject is no longer like a statue, totally distinct from its surroundings, but rather a phenomenon, event-like, that is in deep continuity with it. A subject that is in itself an environment, a network or a series of networks, just to this image, but there are others. And it's very striking how contemporary neurobiology seems to lead in the same direction. This is a neuronal network with the idea that the brain is not a traditional computational machine, it's an environment. And you know that these notions, for example, of neuronal networks, and with the idea that the brain functions more than like a network, than like a unified reality, it enables to explain a lot of strange psychological disorder. Richard Powers, in his novel The Echo Marker, for example, has made a lot of things about the Capgras syndrome, which is basically when you recognize faces, but you believe that the faces of people you care about are actually, these people have been replaced by imposters, which is kind of strange. It can lead you also to kill your sister, mother, whatever, because you think that an extraterrestrial person has taken hold of their bodies. Actually, what is behind that is that there is a module recognize faces, and it's another module that attributes affective values to the same faces. So when these modules begin to dysfunction, they're not in sync anymore, all kinds of strange behavior and impression may happen. So we're diverse, we're environment-like, and we're linked to continuously to what surrounds us. It's not a new hypothesis. Is it a hazard if it's one of the recurring hypothesis of late cybernetics. This is, among other things, the hypothesis of Gregory Bateson in his 1973 steps to an ecology of mind. Interestingly, by the way, when Bill Mitchell develops the same idea in Me++, Bateson is the key reference because he's the guy who theorizes these things. There are links between this contemporary subject and the one envisaged by late cybernetics. One is clearly superficiality, and you may go back if you want to Lyotard postmodern condition and the relation between postmodernism, superficiality, and a kind of cybernetic trend of contemporary society, at least. Second thing is the idea of a subject that perceives patterns rather than forms in the traditional sense. And there again, an abundant literature has been devoted to that. Reinhold Martin's book has shown, for example, how this pattern obsession is present very early in the attempt to find a spatial meaning to cybernetics. For example, in Grigory Kepes' books and exhibition, in which you find things which are strangely ornamental in the modern sense. An important feature, however, that is not that present in cybernetics is that this subjectivity appears under the somewhat contradictory aspect of something that is both distributed and profoundly unique and personal. We are indeed in the age of individual, and I took that because I had a conundrum. The best illustration would have been a Facebook page. And I thought about putting a Facebook page of someone. I was afraid of a trial. And then I thought about myself putting my Facebook page, and I thought that would be too much. So I decided for a compromise. But if you think a little bit what a Facebook page is, it's both a totally extreme manifestation of how connected you are to the rest, inseparable from a series of networks, etc., and a hyper manifesto about your being yourself. So you have these two things at the same time. Which is probably why you find so many in monadologic models, so to say, of the self today. The idea that the self is not a substance, and the only way to understand both its deep personal character and the way that it continuously related to what surrounds it is to consider it as a point of view on the world. A kind of Leibnizian, neo-Leibnizian take on individuality. So my hypothesis at this stage would be that what might very well be returning is actually a connection between the question of ornamentation, rather than ornament, and subjectivity. Subjectivity envisaged as profoundly individual. And this is actually this question. Modernity had not abandoned subjectivity, but it was at first obsessed, rather, as my colleague Michael Hayes has tried to show, rather by erasing the kind of too individual nature of subjectivity. And the post-human Hilbert-Seimer subject is a kind of standardized subject. And then it comes back at the end of modernity. And this is a picture from Sylvia Levin's book, but it's clear that in Neutron it's already back. And I think today we are in the middle of this returning question of subjectivity and using again a kind of ornamental dimension. But there are, of course, unsolved questions. One of them is who produces the ornament? Is it the designer only? What has happened to the worker? This is, by the way, for me, one of the most massive ambiguity of digital culture, is that it seems to assume very often that the designer is also the guy who makes. It's interesting, by the way, that so many of attempts at reflection on robotization have a kind of ornamental term, like grammatio and color, but I could mention my colleague Martin Bechtold also work on surface inscription, very similar in its ornamental kind of tendency. So there is a tendency today, I think, to refuse to deal with these possible differences between designer, maker, etc., between architect and worker, between also architect and client. It is as if the contemporary ornament was suspending the difference, the potential difference between the architect and the client. Or as if all that it was about was sharing a kind of sensorium in which we would all be immersed. The accent put on sensation, immersion, goes, by the way, with a certain suspension of history as if we were meant, through the grace of ornament, to live in a kind of extended, everlasting, intensified present. So all these incertitudes, and that will be my final point in this lecture, may very well have to do with the fact that we haven't been yet able to give, again, a political relevance to contemporary architectural ornaments. Just like, and for me this is part of the same question, we are unable to reconstruct truly collective values and codes of behavior from the kind of highly individual dimension at work today in so many domains. And this is where I would actually argue that we have to deal again with meaning. So for Farshid Moussavi and so many others, meaning is clearly the enemy. But as Robert Levitt has argued in a pretty stimulating article in the Harvard Design Review, actually meaning is always coming back, with ornament. And when you look at that project for Omee, has really meaning gone elsewhere, or aren't we in a kind of almost caricatural kind of quotation of a neo-Arabian kind of universe? This is a project for Jeddah Airport. So what I'm advocating is actually to really deal frontally with this question of meaning, not necessarily going back into the proliferation of science that postmodernism had promoted. Rather, to consider carefully what should be a politics of architectural communication through ornament, something that should be distinct from branding. What I have in mind is a true political and social communication. That should indicate, above all, what kind of collective project architecture is supposed to contribute to. In other words, we need, for example, probably to deal again with questions such as monumentality. This is not the only one, but this is one of the less clear today. We've never built as many monuments as today. Star architecture is very much about monuments, and ornamented monuments, more and more often, but without a clear understanding of what kind of message, beyond the enthrallment, the sensation, etc., they are supposed to convey. Of course, any message, any meaning is sooner or later outdated, but this might be the condition to live fully in the flow of historical condition. Above all, I think to understand clearly what is the new relation between ornament, monument, and the kind of society we want to achieve in the digital age, this is really, for me, the question. It's interesting how the digital world gives us new and unprecedented means to understand society. For example, this is a map of one of my colleagues at MIT, Carlo Ratti, that I use often. You can now map pretty much what individuals do at an individual level and integrate that into more global map, real-time maps. This is cell phones called from people going to a concert of Madonna in Rome. I like, by the way, the fact that it has a strange ornamental connotation there again. The real question for me is how to translate the new understanding we're beginning to gain on how society functions today, a totally inert by digital culture society. How are we going to translate that into visual codes carried by architecture? And which might be, for me, one of the functions of architectural ornament. Let me be clear to conclude. The question is not, for me, definitely not to reinvent the architectural orders, but how to use ornament so that it conveys part of this new understanding, of this new order, if you want, that characterizes the society in which we live. Thank you very much.
Request you'll take some questions.
Sure. Yes.
I was wondering whether, and I like the switch from ornament to ornamentation, whether ornamentation has been with us all the time. And that, for example, in the monuments, the ornamentation became whiteness. So the same people that did ornaments before, they are now doing plastering and do the whole thing white. And that whiteness is a bit like a star.
Could be a possibility.
So that, in fact, it never really, it was more embedded, like the journalist in the Iraq War. or embedded, you couldn't really see the difference between the journalists and the army. In fact, they had the same opinions about the war. So this embeddedness is an interesting one. It seems it kind of disappeared, but because it was so evidently on the surface, namely the whiteness, or even the white architects in New York. And then, of course, in postmodernism, the debate again started to bubble up. And now it's back again, and it has maybe more to do with tattooing. So that
it would be back to a kind of 19th century, cranial impulse.
Yeah, exactly. So this is just a kind of meager reaction to what you're saying, because it also links up with subjectivity, because this becomes closer to the subject itself, namely the face, the seduction, that ultimately that whiteness is there to seduce us, to believe that the modern was terribly important to us.
I think I would probably agree on part of it, because I think it's true that in some ways ornament never disappeared truly, but I think some of its functions were, however, suspended. For example, I think there was an attempt to reduce this question of subjectivity to a kind of mass subject condition, at least at the beginning of modernity. And then probably the individual returns really already in the end of the modern movement. Really. The difference I see is precisely linked to this question of repression versus, I would argue that in some ways, yes, the absence of ornament in modernity, if you like, is a form of ornament. You could argue that, which would definitely, my colleague Michael Hayes would like this kind of thing, in which the absence of a thing is the thing which negates itself in order to affirm its presence. He likes that kind of thing. So yes, I could agree with that. I, however, think that what is returning is a kind of intensity in this question of the relation between subjectivity and politics, for various reasons. And it's not the same subjectivity. So there is a special intensity to that. Whereas probably this question was treated at another level. By politics, for example, was treated a lot at the level of planning by modern architecture. That would be my immediate reaction. But I do agree, there is something.
There's another connection with modernism, which
is
the second connection between ornament and modernism, which you mentioned briefly, which is the contention that Frank Lloyd Wright took Sullivan's ornament and made it into a building, right? The grammar of the ornament, the ornament is grammar. That somehow ornamental language was displaced into the formation of buildings to the extent that Mies, Corbusier, Wright were all accomplished ornamentalists. It somehow comes forward to the present. I can't really connect it as well as you have to subjectivity, but I'm continuing to think about, I'm sure you know Wright's textile houses in California, which are very similar to the kind of ornament that's being done today, very dissimilar to the kind of ornament.
Actually, in the class I teach on the 19th century, teaching a class on 19th century architecture in the design school is always, you have to find a pitch. To convince the student, and and of course I take the usual thing, guess what, this is going to enable you to understand better modern architecture. And actually, in the case of ornament, I very often think that the very problems that some of the problems that 19th century tried to address through ornament were addressed by modernity by displacing the problem. Take industrialization. Industrialization in the 19th century, it's not prefabrication as the 20th century will understand it, but it's actually the prefabrication of ornament is a fundamental question. What do you do with prefabricated ornament and all the Ruskinian debate about it? And the 20th century displaces it in the realm of tectonics. So there are a number of displacements like that. Actually, let's be totally clear, my problem was not to propose an interpretation really based on the idea that ornament had disappeared. I'm more interested in the discourse on why is it that we want to present it as a return. That's more my point, to be honest. And this is why, by the way, there are very few elements on the modern movement, but it's true that I could have integrated in the story. Also, a lot of constructive details. Play actually functions very close to ornament. With, however, the suspension in a lot of modern building of the question of the added. This is where, you know, the contrast is nicer with full materials.
It's interesting that in terms of what you were saying about ornament today being somewhat immersive, right? That had sort of...
Yeah, it has definitely, for a lot of designers, that connotation.
It's very similar to the experience of Wright's prairie houses, early prairie houses, where the ornamental pattern, you can almost match them up, match them up between the ornaments and the plants, where you can actually walk inside of the ornament. Buildings conceived in that way. Right? And it's an interesting sort of listening to what you say.
Well, it has also something to do with rhythm, ornamental rhythm, which is something you took from Sullivan. Yes.
I was wondering what you think the relationship between current local attitudes, yeah, like contemporary attitudes, political attitudes on hierarchy and on
Hierarchy? I don't think the problem today, you know, I think we're no longer, probably, for better and for worse, in these problems of covenants, you know, ornament and social hierarchy. We are more, for me, one of the big questions today is how we reconcile, you know, the sensorium thing, you know, you're in an immersive bath, has a kind of regressive connotation also. It can be immersive, you know, what is immersive in the fetus? Kind of condition. So, and there is something like that in a lot of sensorial discourses today. So the real question is how to reconstruct a true political space in a sensorium. Which is not the problem of the fetus, of course, but which is the problem of we as subjects confronted to this kind of sprawling, ornamental, hypnotic, haptic kind of universe that is proposed by many designers. I think it's a question. Just like, you know, how the sprawl of all this digital information, etc., in which we can lose ourselves endlessly, you know, how do we reconstruct true political agency in the middle of that? This is, for me, why it's so political. Yeah.
I really like the idea of somehow getting at the notion of the political in ornament. And it seems to me that you have to somehow get to the question of reception through that you can't have a politic without reception. So I'm thinking of three phases. They're probably very, very crude or too crude. The first phase would be, say, pre-20th century, where ornament is a representation of something, a leaf, a figure, whatever it might be. The second is material. It's a modern means, where material is a kind of statement of fact. It's not a representation of anything other than itself. And the third, which I'm contemplating right now, sort of thinking out loud, is something like the water cube or most contemporary versions of ornament, which are technique. The issue being there that in the first phase, there's a kind of possibility for reception outside, or a kind of populism almost. In the second, it's kind of squarely located within architecture and sort of straddling between the two. In the third, it's an internal discourse technique, a milling line or a geometric conceit used in the design of a wall. And I'm wondering if reception actually is going to constantly, contemporary reception will constantly bump into the fact that that's an internal discourse, the most recent. It's an internal technique that we're trying to construct a politic out of.
It's a good point, although like every taxonomy I would find a lot of counterexamples. For example, the age of, do not forget once again that moldings were part of the ornamental regime and they're not representative. There are a lot of non-representative stuff in the traditional Vitruvian thing, Wackermühle. And moldings, you know, were part of almost the alphabet of, you know, many ornamental things. So I would probably complicate. But where I would agree, it's true that today ornament is produced by techniques like pixelization, patterning. They are technical. However, take the cube. It's very striking how the effect produced on the people who visit it is almost, you know, there again, there is a kind of fascination. So I think we are both in a very technological regime, but endorsed. You know, we were talking with the students about the Bilbao Museum, and in some ways, the Bilbao is produced already with the software, etc., and immediately endorsed by people who don't care about the technology. So I think today the ornament, you have this double regime. I don't see I do agree that the problem is to know also what we do with the technology. But where I would totally agree with you, I don't see, let's say, the dichotomy between technology and the reception, that fundamental a problem by the end. I think the real problem is more, is more that, you know, we don't have a project, a kind of collective project that is clear enough. And you know, it's not, architecture cannot wait passively for this project to emerge. It has also to be part of trying to shape this project, trying to understand how we want to be collectively. How we can be both totally, you know, in this kind of sensory kind of thing, and at the same time acting individually.
So how can your argument not lead inevitably to an architecture purely of the screen and the sort of mediated surface of messages? And if in terms of an ornament that can respond quickly, can offer messages and is completely sensorial as well. So it seems that, and I find it interesting that in the talk you tend to still favor ornament as a material thing as opposed to a digital image.
Well, first of all, that's an easy answer, but not totally easy. I don't want to do a total theory of architecture through ornament. So I don't think we should consider that all the architectural problems today are solvable for ornament, which is what Farshid tends to do, by the way, telling us that, you know, you do an ornamented skin, and that's it. You know, the architect has done his job, and then the programmer can do whatever he wants. I think precisely the reverse. That, you know, ornament was never the whole of architecture. Even if it was an essential part, there were still walls, etc. For something to be essential as added, you still have something to which you add it. So that's maybe a trivial syntactic consideration, but that's important in the affair. That's the first thing. The second thing, I do think that we have to do with the skin. It's true that ornament has to do today with the skin. But once again, the skin is not the whole, and I'm hoping that we will find ways to escape the kind of skin-only kind of thing. Even if I do think, talking with the student, I was trying to explain the fact that today it's true that we have rehabilitated the skin, and with the idea that, you know, Paul Valéry once wrote that nothing is more deep than surface. There is something like that today in architecture, and no denying it. So it's true that I think that we are in a kind of superficial condition, at least for ornament, but ornament is not the whole of architecture.
I think it's interesting that there's been a theme through the discussion prior to this and the now of the human body maybe as analog. I'm not sure that totally carries out, but to go there for a minute, Lars just evoked the notion of a tattoo. And I think that when you compare a tattoo, let's say, to the water cube, right? You have a tattoo on the skin. It's not representational. It is at least applied, and it is not continuous. So in other words, it's a moment of interruption or subversion to the continuity of the human skin. But then when the skin is deformed, that applied image is also sort of subverted, so you have the second level. And I don't know how you would relate. I don't know what I'm asking exactly, but
neither do I, but that's an interesting series of remarks, and I like the tattoo one. I'm going to answer a question that I have not understood, which would be, actually, I disagree a bit with the tattoo thing, because I'm not sure. I think you're right, tattoos tend to be local. Even on the, what's the name of the girl who plays in Transformer that my son is madly in love with? You know, who has tattoo all over.
Only on her back.
Yeah, a big thing on her back. Yes, exactly. We seem to share the same very high-low reference. Tattoo is, in a way, it's true, except for the Yakuza, is localized. So it's a bit different from the water cube. Which might be, by the way, something to think. If I was to think of what would be the real concrete tattoo, let's take also a blockbuster movie, you know, when the guy becomes, you know, totally eaten or swallowed by the digital, you know, board, whatever, and becomes a kind of motherboard himself with all his skin covered, etc. Tron-like, if you like. That's ornament today. So it's true that in some ways returning to the tattoo, could be an idea, but the localized tattoo.
Right, I think it's precisely because it's different from the water tube that it holds the potential. It is localized, and therefore it differentiates itself from the surface.
I think that it's true that one of the things I'm thinking also is that we have a discourse on the skin that is a kind of total discourse in which the skin should be everywhere the same. Far sheet thing is very much, it's a universal skin condition. But guess what? Even our skin has different moments, etc. So that might be also something we want to investigate. I like the tattoo idea. That would give me a pretext to put a transformer here on.
The former king of Denmark was tattooed completely from here to here. You could never see it because
he was a Yakuza.
And he was completely tattooed, every inch of him. So now it was only his hands and his hands and his feet were not tattooed.
Revenge of the king.
Whatever, but it's tattoos are serious business.
I know. No, that's why I'm thinking, this is a model. Yeah.
I have a methodological question on this. I'm wondering if, I can see you showing exactly the same logic, historically, and talking about rhetoric. And given the conversation about communication, I'm wondering if the scale of the analysis shouldn't change as you get into contemporary work. So I'm wondering if, and this goes a little bit to Sarah's question, if in contemporary work you don't also need to talk about all the organization of the building in its relationship to ornament, and look at a building scale as opposed to the scale of the sort of treatise scale of these gone by. You actually need to look at the work, the rhetoric of the work, and then sort of move to the whether that work is.
I'm not sure because the scale of ornaments is also quite variable in former ages. I've shown details, etc. because that's easy, but if you take the Louvre, it's a very big ornamented stuff. So ornaments, no, I do agree that taking more into account scale is definitely, probably by the way, more in association with the human body. Because I think even the way the body is understood is understood at different scales, different level. No, I would agree on that. But to oppose, today and yesterday, thinking in some ways that yesterday was smaller, etc. Well, it was smaller, nothing like, giant airports yesterday, but I think what is new today is more for me the kind of blurring between structure and movement. That's for me something really good. That things become so big, and with all these research on the so-called kind of Bauman-like non-Cartesian structure, still trying to understand what is a non-Cartesian structure, but you find a strange convergence between structure and movement. So that could be definitely questioned. But I think it has more to do with categories like supporting and supported, and the blurring of these categories. The fact that the notion of infrastructure is no longer clear, all kinds of questions. But as I said at the beginning, this is for me an ongoing research, not yet fully packaged.
Could we imagine a very different suggestion that we are, in a sense, at the ultimate stage of cognitive fatigue, sort of the rococo, and that all this wrinkling will eventually just go away because it's an end of an era of great frivolity with lots of money, and now we're entering a phase where rudimentary.
Perhaps we shouldn't forget that we've inherited so many things from the Rococo period. That we should take the Rococo seriously. Well, the question is not necessarily whether ornament is going to continue exactly in this order, but I think ornament is indicative of a kind of shift. Just like the Rococo period is very often, for example, it's the moment when interiors become gendered. It's one of the things that has been studied again and again by historians. This is a period in which new notion of intimacy, etc., arise. So my guess would be that, even if ornament has, kind of shown disappears, there are a number of questions that will remain.
I'm wondering if you're troubled by the fact that a person of your DNA, engineering, technical, etc., is now working on ornament.
I was always fascinated by superficial things. My dream was actually to write one day, I spoke of makeup, to write something about the relation between space and makeup. So I found the ornament as a kind of demi-mesure on that path.
Maybe I have to bring back all of that.
Yeah, all kinds of things. But no, I like the idea probably because I think that, yes, it's true. I like the very heavy, or I like the butterfly thing. It's true. It's in between that I get bored. But ornament doesn't.
Stacy, last question.
I was wondering about a corporate logo, the corporate client, that kind of ornament gets stuck onto the building.
I excluded branding.
Okay. Well, does it compromise that? Does it compromise architecture in that architecture might become the product of the product, the reputation of the brand, thereby making the architecture susceptible to markets such as Enron and it's that big, name? Does the building fail if the reputation and the brand fails? So does architecture have to out-identify the identity of the brand?
Well, on branding, I excluded it because I think branding is not the problem. That's a couple of things. First, architecture was compromised from the start. So, architects, by definition, architecture is compromised because it has to deal with clients. So, yes. Second, branding, you mentioned Enron, but, go to Harvard. There, the number of logo totally branding and rebranding, and in case you haven't understood it, they're 3 times Veritas, etc. That's branding, and then you can buy a T-shirt with the same thing, and Harvard has a still, although to be checked, a better reputation than Enron, but it's the same logic by the end. So, does it mean no? Because I think the kings fell in a lot of places for various reasons, and we can still look, when you look at Versailles, that a lot of things, the political project that was behind ended as a massive failure, and we still have Versailles. I think part of what has architecture always to accept is that it's tributary to its condition of production and that it's dated. But strange.